There was a time when humans had no cities, no farms, no roads, and no permanent homes. No borders separated one land from another. No maps told people where they were. No governments marked territory. The world was vast, dangerous, and constantly changing. And in that world, ancient humans kept moving. They moved across grasslands and deserts, through forests, river valleys, and frozen plains. They crossed mountains, coastlines, and eventually entire continents. To a modern person, this might seem exhausting, even irrational. Why not settle down somewhere safe? Why not stay where food was familiar and shelter was known? But for ancient humans, staying still was often the greater risk. To understand why our ancestors migrated so often, we have to forget the modern idea that a stable life means living in one place. For most of human history, mobility was stability. Movement was not disorder. It was not failure. It was survival. The first reason ancient humans kept moving was simple: food. Before agriculture, people lived as hunter-gatherers. That meant they did not grow most of what they ate. They found it. They hunted wild animals, gathered roots, berries, nuts, shellfish, fruits, and edible plants. But those resources were never guaranteed in one location forever. Animals migrated. Plants were seasonal. Rivers changed. Herds disappeared. Forests burned. Droughts came. If the food moved, humans had to move with it. Imagine a group of early humans living near a grassland, rich with game. For a season, the land provides everything they need. But then temperatures shift. Rain patterns change. The herd they depend on begins moving north. Suddenly, staying behind means starvation. In that kind of world, migration wasn't a dramatic event. It was part of life, and ancient people weren't constantly wandering without purpose. Their movement was often highly intelligent and deeply connected to the landscape. They knew where water returned after the rains. They knew when certain fruits ripened, where fish gathered, and which animals followed seasonal routes. Migration, in many cases, was a form of environmental knowledge passed through generations. The second reason was water. For early humans, fresh water was more than a necessity. It was life itself. A group could survive for some time with limited food. Without water, survival collapsed quickly. And in prehistoric environments, water could never be taken for granted. A lake could shrink. A river could shift course. Wetlands could dry up. Entire regions could become uninhabitable over the course of years, decades, or even a single season. If water became unreliable, people had no choice but to leave. This is one of the most important truths about ancient migration. People did not move only because they wanted more. Often they moved because the place they knew could no longer support them. And that brings us to the third reason: climate. Ancient humans lived through enormous climatic instability. Ice ages expanded and retreated. Temperatures rose and fell. Rainfall patterns changed across generations. Coastlines moved. Deserts expanded. Green corridors opened and closed. The world of early humans was not a stable backdrop. It was a force that constantly reshaped their options. When climate changed, ecosystems changed with it. And when ecosystems changed, human life had to adapt. Some areas became richer and more attractive. Others became harsher and more dangerous. Migration was often the human response to environmental pressure. In fact, some of the biggest movements in human history were tied to climate windows, periods when changing conditions suddenly made new routes possible. A greener Sahara, for example, may have opened pathways that allowed human groups to move across regions that would later become extremely hostile. Lower sea levels during ice ages created land bridges, allowing people to enter new continents. So when we ask why ancient humans migrated, the answer is not only that they were searching, it is also that the Earth itself was rearranging the map beneath their feet. The fourth reason was population pressure. Even small hunter-gatherer groups depended on a careful balance with the land around them. A region can only support so many people before food becomes harder to find, game becomes overhunted, and social tension begins to rise. When populations grew, even slightly, some groups likely split apart. One part of the community stayed, another moved outward, looking for new territory and fresh resources. This process may have happened again and again over thousands of years, slowly pushing humans across vast distances. Migration, then, was not always an emergency. Sometimes it was a release valve, a way to prevent conflict, reduce pressure, and expand opportunity. Which leads to another reason ancient humans moved: competition. Humans were not alone in the landscape. They shared their world with predators, rival groups, and in some regions, even other human species. Competition for food, water, shelter, and territory could make one area too dangerous or too crowded to remain in. If another group controlled a water source, a hunting ground, or a seasonal camp, leaving may have been safer than fighting. In some cases, migration may have helped groups avoid violence. In others, it may have been driven by it. And yet, not all migration was caused by fear. Some of it was caused by something deeply human: curiosity. This may be the hardest reason to prove scientifically, but it may also be one of the most important. Humans are not passive creatures. We are observers, problem solvers, and explorers. Even in deep prehistory, there were likely moments when groups did not move because they had to flee, but because they saw a possibility beyond the horizon. A distant valley, a coastline with richer resources, a warmer plain, a route followed by animals, a story passed between generations of a place where life was easier. Ancient humans were practical, but they were also imaginative. At some point, someone looked at an unfamiliar landscape and decided to keep going. That instinct changed history. It is easy to forget how extraordinary this was. To move into unknown territory without maps, vehicles, or written records required courage, memory, cooperation, and trust. Every migration was a gamble. New places could offer abundance, but also disease, predators, unfamiliar weather, and terrain no one fully understood. And still, humans kept moving. Why? Because mobility became our advantage. Unlike many species, humans were remarkably adaptable. We could survive in savannas, forests, mountains, cold steppes, and coastal zones. We learned to make tools, build temporary shelters, control fire, and work together in groups. We did not need one perfect environment. We learned to adjust to many. That flexibility made migration possible on a scale few other species could achieve. In other words, ancient humans did not spread across the world simply because the world invited them. They spread because they were one of the rare species capable of responding creatively to challenge. Movement was a technology of survival. It also transformed human culture. Every time groups migrated, they encountered new plants, animals, climates, and landscapes. They developed new tools, new hunting methods, new clothing, and new ways of organizing life. Migration forced innovation. It rewarded memory, planning, and social cooperation. Over time, it also created diversity. As human groups spread and adapted to different environments, they developed distinct traditions, skills, and identities. Migration did not just move people through the world. It shaped what humans became. And yet there is an irony at the center of this story. The same species that spent most of its history moving would eventually become the species that built walls, states, farms, and permanent cities. Around 12,000 years ago, in several parts of the world, some human groups began settling more permanently. Agriculture made this possible. Instead of following food, people could produce it. Villages formed, then towns, then civilizations. But this settled life was not the original human condition. It was the late development. For tens of thousands of years before that, migration was normal. Movement was not a sign that life was unstable. It was the reason life continued at all, and maybe that history still lives inside us. Even now, in a world of passports, mortgages, and fixed addresses, humans remain restless. We relocate for work, safety, opportunity, and hope. We cross borders for a better future. We explore remote places. We dream about elsewhere. We still respond to environmental stress, economic pressure, and the possibility of a different life somewhere beyond where we are. In that sense, ancient migration is not just a prehistoric story. It is a human story. Our ancestors moved because they had to survive, because animals moved, because water vanished, because climates shifted, because populations grew, because conflict existed, because opportunity appeared, and perhaps because deep within the human mind there has always been a willingness to step into the unknown. So the next time you imagine prehistoric people, don't picture them as primitive wanderers moving without direction. Picture them as strategic survivors in a changing world. Picture them reading the land, following patterns, making decisions, taking risks, and carrying knowledge across generations. Picture them not as people who failed to settle, but as people who mastered movement. Because ancient humans were always moving for the same reason all life moves when the world changes: to endure. And in enduring, they did something even greater. They became us.